Hey, it's Kristen Eykel, and I want to welcome you to joining us here at SAND, the Science and Non-Duality Conference 2018. I am here in beautiful San Jose with this fantastic teacher that I've just really enjoyed meeting him and working with him. Actually, we met here last year, and we also met in Italy this past summer. He was presenting his idea about his book, which is so awesome. I had to share it with you. This is Mr. Mark Gober. Mark, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. So, as you mentioned, I wrote a book. It's called An End to Upside Down Thinking: Dispelling the Myth that the Brain Produces Consciousness and the Implications for Everyday Life.
The implications for everyday life is important. So how, if we understand that consciousness is not where we think it comes from, and how is it going to change our life if we change our paradigms?
It's a big question, and it took a whole book to get to the implications.
Which will have to clearly get the book.
Well, we have to start with what's the conventional assumption about these ideas. And it's one, so we can maybe start with my background, because I came from the conventional perspective and now have flipped it to this alternative perspective, which I think is actually real. The conventional perspective is that the universe is made of matter. There was a big bang 13.8 billion years ago, started the universe. This matter came together in a random fashion, and it led to a biological being like a human.
Here we are.
We developed brains, and then consciousness came out of our brain. We started with matter, we got consciousness. There are big questions with this theory, though. We don't know how a brain could ever produce consciousness. Science magazine calls it the number 2 question that remains in all of science. So there's an alternative possibility, which is that the brain is like an antenna receiver or transceiver, receiving and transmitting, or like a filtering mechanism, but the consciousness isn't produced by the body itself.
And from the yogic perspective, that absolutely makes sense, because for the yogis, your brain is encased in this skull, and it has all around it it has the cerebrospinal fluid around it, which actually travels down, coating the spine, and then transmitting this consciousness through the body through your central nervous system. And that is this interface between the physical body and the non-physical realms of understanding. It's how you oh, I knew my best friend was going to call, or, oh my God, I was just thinking of you when you showed up. Those random coincidences, which are not coincidences, which show that we're actually all vibrating on this field of consciousness and downloading within our cranium, transmitted through the brains of our family, friends, and loved ones into ours, and then pops up as oh, call your mother. Okay, I will.
So I agree with that, but I'm going to take a step back and say that 2+ years ago, I would not have agreed with that.
You'd have been whatever.
I wouldn't have known how to respond to that. Because I used to buy into this materialist perspective that consciousness is produced by the brain, localized to the brain, and that's it. When your brain is gone, your consciousness is gone, your memories are wiped out, life has no meaning because once you're dead, it's over. That's kind of the paradigm.
It's really depressing.
It's depressing. But
it causes fear.
It causes fear, but I thought that was real. And in some ways it doesn't cause fear, because it's well, it doesn't matter. Once I'm dead.
Interesting point. Hey, who cares what I'm doing now? If I'm just going to, rape, pillage, and steal, it doesn't really matter because no one's watching. But what do we know about that?
Right, so I would argue that is not necessarily true. And I'll step back and just talk about my background for a second so you know where I'm coming from. I don't research consciousness at a university. I work in finance. So I'm a partner at a firm called Sherpa in Silicon Valley, advising technology companies on their innovation and business strategy. And prior to that, I worked in investment banking with UBS in New York during the financial crisis. So started in July of 2008. And prior to that, I was at Princeton University, where I was captain of the tennis team. So very different background, like sports and business. And just became interested in these topics about 2 years ago when I listened to podcasts that exposed me to the topics, ended up researching, and then ended up writing the book very quickly over a few weekends.
Well, I think what's really quite cool about this story is that, 2.5 years ago, he would have said you were an average guy, thinking average thoughts, doing, a normal, quote-unquote, life, right? But the moment we give ourselves the opportunity to slightly expand our thinking, listening to a podcast, going to a conference, reading a book, being exposed to these new ideas, it does offer the opportunity, if you are willing to do so, to let your consciousness become more malleable, right? To take in new information and possibly change your worldview for this wonderful new emergence that you could write some crazy, awesome book that would inspire us. You could make some beautiful work of art. That's what I think is really quite beautiful in what you're sharing, is that this is the consciousness available for everyone, should they choose to look.
Totally. And something you just said resonated with me. Basically, I wasn't closed to these ideas because I disagreed with the evidence. I just didn't even know that the evidence existed. So it was the mere exposure to it where I said, okay, there's this whole body of evidence here, both scientific and anecdotal, but it's all there. How do I reconcile that with this old worldview? They don't match. There needs to be a new framework to account for all this stuff. So the exposure to new information, I think, causes us to reconcile what's there.
Absolutely. And the exposure to the information is absolutely everywhere now because it has been growing in its popularity and its acceptance. But I also wanted to touch one thing as well. We were talking about, there was a wonderful researcher that was at SAN that I was very inspired by, named Dr. Pim van Lommel, and he's been studying this since the 80s. He's a cardiac surgeon who was wondering what happened when all these near-death experiences were happening with people in the cardiac experience. So I know that you also reference a lot of that in your book.
So the near-death experience is where people have lucid memories when their brain is off, like in the case of cardiac arrest, or they have a highly impaired brain. And the conventional model would predict that there should be no memory during that period, or if there's a memory, it should just be a hallucination, because how could an almost non-functional or completely non-functional brain produce any memories or a lucid experience? And yet what's found at these studies is that some percentage of people who have the near-death experience report this whole phenomenon. And Dr. Van Lommel has done studies on this, and they've been reported in very credible places. The Lancet Journal is one very credible journal, where 18% of the people that he looked at who had these near-death experiences in cardiac arrest. So this is extreme physiological trauma. This is
measurable. It's like they can see what's happening. Your brain goes to sleep after 15 seconds of the heart stopping. It's measurable, and yet
18% of the people have a lucid memory. And it's similar to what people have described throughout the ages. So something's going on where there is a functional consciousness that's acting independently of a functional body.
And when they have these near-death experiences, they have these same similar conversations that generally happen to them. They go through tunnels of light. They're greeted by sentient, conscious, loving beings who know them intimately, maybe friends, family, even animals. Sometimes people meet up with their dead pets. And then they're also given these experiences where they have something called the life review. And it's that idea of like your life flashed before your eyes. You know everything in a second. And yet, they didn't just know their own perspective.
Right. This is really profound. So take a step back for a second.
Take a breath.
And just acknowledge, what if this is actually real? If these memories are happening when there's no bodily function. The person has a life review, experiencing their whole life in a flash. But sometimes they take on the perspective of the people that they affected. So let's say Bob is having his life review. He's in cardiac arrest. He's hovering over his body. He sees his whole life in front of him. And he goes back to a moment in his life where he was really mean to Jane. And he sees that event through Jane's eyes. Comes back into his body, and his life has changed because he realizes, wait, I was judging myself for how I behaved towards Jane. It wasn't how much money I made that matters. So people who have these experiences are often profoundly changed. They many times get divorced, they change their job, their priorities shift, they become much less materialistic. So it's a big deal to see that there are actual changes that happen, and we're seeing things that are not hallucinations that are occurring when there's a non-functional brain.
Well, and it's quite beautiful, too, when you begin to see that not only what happens to you matters, but then what happens to our community matters. And so that takes that whole idea of we are one out of the bumper sticker silly realm and turns it into this actual construct where you have the deep, direct experience that you are one with the entire organism that is around us. The flowers, the people, the plants, the animals, the earth herself. And that you then are in this fabric of consciousness, which takes the ego and kind of shifts its perspective and gives us this awareness that we are connected.
Right. And I think the life review is one of the best cases of direct evidence. I think the other cases of psychic phenomenon, surviving bodily death, which children who have past life memories, it all points in this direction that consciousness is the basis of reality. But the idea that we're connected as part of the same consciousness, that can explain this near-death experience life review phenomenon, where a person is taking on the perspective of someone else. It's like it's just a different lens of the same consciousness.
It's so funny because when I heard Dr. Lommel say that, it made so much sense to me. As a hypnotherapist, we do a lot of work with alternate timelines. I don't like to call it past life because past life implies that it's a linear construct, and I don't see it as linear. I see it as alternate universal moments happening, which is why if we activate your trauma, you can go directly back to the moment of trauma. No full stop, the whole body is reacting as if it's happening now, which means the trauma is not just activating within you, but that whole timeline of when the trauma happened is still occurring for you, right? That's why people have flashbacks, they have memories, they can smell it, they can feel it. at that same time, if we take people into that alternate timeline experience, and I had this happen sort of spontaneously, took someone back in this alternate timeline experience, and then she instantly popped into the other 3 people that were in that moment, and she could see herself. This was in the early 90s. I'd never heard of it before, so I thought it was just some sort of fun experiment. But it's been proven time and time again, and so even in these altered states of consciousness, I would posit in your meditations, if you're really, really good at it, you could literally go into the consciousness of the beings around you and have that experience now. I don't think you have to wait till you're dead.
And this is reported in people who have psychic abilities and people who channel. So one I'm thinking of is Paul Selig. Are you familiar with his work?
I've heard his name, yeah.
Okay, so he's someone I interviewed for my forthcoming podcast. Paul Selig, he describes it as tuning into different stations, where he just starts to hear voices and then he takes dictation. That's how he describes it.
Yeah.
And he starts speaking very quickly and then repeats what he says. And so it's these beings that are speaking through him. But I mention him because he talks about being able to read people, where he basically takes on their consciousness and feels their emotions through them. So it's like this radio tuner that some people are very, they have an ability to do it better than many of us.
It's like Edward Cayce.
It's similar.
Yeah.
It's a different type of channeling, but it's the same phenomenon.
He was able to sleep on a book and know the book. I mean, we could go on and on. That's a whole other show. But it's really quite phenomenal when we start to think less linearly, less the way it's always been, and start to expand that maybe there's a whole other conversation here. And of course, we invite your conversation in on this because that's the point. This should be a dialogue. I would look at this as being a continuing dialogue. Your experiences, the experiences of our community, help all of us to understand it a little bit more and maybe even have more compassion for those ideas that we haven't yet adopted as our own.
Yes. So there's an important point embedded in that, which is that we're very biased by our common sense and by what our eyes show us and what our ordinary senses teach us about reality. But what we learn, even when we look at quantum physics, which is accepted physics, it's totally counterintuitive, but we know it's real. So when we're thinking about reality and thinking about things like nonlinear time or non-local consciousness, it doesn't make sense, but that doesn't mean that it's not real just because it doesn't make sense.
I love that. Thank you so much for watching. Look forward to hearing more from you. Definitely buy his book. It's on Amazon. Thank you so much for being present.